I think in the recent traditional music in the West in the last couple of centuries, the percussionist has become known as something of a quirk, making sort of noises in the back of an orchestra. But I think the point is that in any other continent in the world, if you didn't play percussion, you would actually be considered as something of a quirk. If you came to an African kid and showed them a violin, they say, "What on earth do you play with that? You couldn't possibly play anything with that." And here you bring all these instruments here, and they think, "What on earth is that? I've never seen that before." But these are terribly old instruments, most of them. They've existed for thousands of years. In Bartók's sonata for two pianos and percussion, he used the piano as a percussion instrument. He realized that the piano was a percussion instrument, and it was because of that that he thought of putting percussion instruments with the piano. Not just one percussion, but two pianos and two percussionists. And the interesting thing, the important thing about the work, is that for the first time in Western music, in that sort of combination of chamber music, the percussionists were brought up to the same level as the pianists. In other words, there you had a traditional musician playing a real instrument and a percussionist, which in those days, of course, was an ordinary orchestral percussionist, being brought in absolutely in the same level as the pianists. And Bartók says at the beginning of the score that they should be equal. There's also a rather amusing note which says that the one of the pianists must supervise the percussionists during the rehearsals. Actually, if you listen to the recording of Bartók and his wife playing that piece in a live concert years and years ago, you realize what a terrible state percussion playing was in. One mustn't forget that there was a very strong tradition of xylophone playing, in particular in Hungary at that time, but this was a completely different tradition from the, as it were, straight musician who came in and he read the music, and he found it very difficult, as you can hear on that recording. And in fact, the poor percussionists get completely lost several times, so much so that Bartók actually puts the xylophone part in on the piano. From the Bartók, we can see other composers more recently developing the relationship of piano to percussion, which is a very important one. I think one of the thrills about being involved in the very recent percussion music is every now and again you do get given a great deal of freedom about what instruments you use. I think in that respect, recent percussion music divides quite sharply into two categories. The category where a composer is absolutely specific about what instruments you should use, and even instructs at the beginning of the score how to make them, as is the case with actually a lot of my music and Stockhausen Contactor, where he instructs you how to make the wooden tom-toms. But insofar as it's almost inconceivable for a composer to know what instruments any given percussionist has at his disposal. And in fact, if you, as a composer, if you specify too precisely what the instruments are, you can in fact be limiting yourself, because certain performers have collected instruments from all around the world and one person may have a fantastic low drum or low gong or something which another person doesn't have. So in that case, the composer is doing us a great service by leaving the choice of instruments really largely up to us. One of the classic examples of this is Xenakis Zappa, where he gives you 6 categories of instruments, A, B, C, D, E and F, and he describes what sort of instruments you should use in each category. Very loose descriptions such as skin instruments, metal instruments, wooden instruments, bamboo and so on. There is an enormous amount of scope in a piece like that, which is one of the reasons that it makes it one of the most popular and widely played of modern solo percussion works. Also makes it a completely different piece from one performance to another. Even one performer may change his version many, many times. I have certainly done so. It's not so much from the performer that the stimulus comes, but from the composer. performer is quite happy to continue using the same instruments it's been for hundreds of years. It's always the composers who push the thing forward, and they become very unpopular for doing so. You have to take into consideration the fact that composers are trying to advance the whole idea of percussion, and they are trying to find new sounds and play instruments in ways that they haven't been played before to find new sounds. But you also have to be able to see through that. Sometimes you'll see a score which has got Javanese gong, for example, play with a metal beater. Well, that immediately tells to me that for a start he doesn't know what a Javanese gong is. Certainly doesn't know how to look after it. And what it tells me is that he's probably found a gong made in Europe which you can get certain sounds by playing with a metal beater. But then on another day of his life he discovers how marvellous sound the Javanese gong can make. And he puts two and two together and he says, play the Javanese gong with a metal stick. And it's crazy. You can't play a Javanese gong with a metal stick. First of all, you'll ruin it. And secondly, it makes a sound which is absolutely against the character of the instrument. So what I'm looking for is somebody who can understand the instruments, but also happens to be a good composer, because there are percussionists who write music, of course, like there are guitarists who write music, who are very good at writing music which is well heard for the instrument and well written, so that it's actually fun to play, let's say, but not necessarily particularly interesting music. So one's looking for a combination of a good composer who understands the instruments. Also, they have to understand a great deal about rhythm, because I think that percussion equals rhythm. You cannot divorce rhythm from percussion. My own work, is based on ancient Greek texts, in that the rhythms of the meter of the poetry and the writings on which it's based dictate completely the musical architecture, the rhythmic architecture of the music. used a variety of ancient Greek texts, with comedy, tragedy and satire all juxtaposed in a rather surreal way to create the impression of some imaginary pagan festivity. At the climax of the section from the Bacchae, the percussionist assumes the terrifying voice of Dionysus, causing earthquakes, fire and destruction. This incites the singer to enter, screaming a beautifully ironic text, demanding respect for the human voice over this cheap, drunken drumming. The barrier between what we might call 20th century classical music and rock music, jazz, is being completely broken down. There are two different approaches, of course, because rock music and jazz is largely improvised. But all the time people are trying to break down, to make written music sound improvised and sound free and complex and sophisticated in that sort of way.
Uses sounds drawn from Indian music, vocalized drum sounds. We have T, which is a very dry sound, Re, which is also a dry sound. So you have two dry sounds, and Ke, which is on the other tabla, called the bayan, and Da, which is two together. So if you put the whole title together, you have Ti, Re, Ti, Ke, Da. 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 The title of the piece by James Dillon. Various elements of this rhythm are disjointed throughout the piece, dislocated and montaged in different ways, like a game, to actually pull you along, draw you into the piece.
there's one extraordinary work for solo percussion by the Yugoslav composer Vinko Globokar called Touché. It takes as a text part of Brecht's Galileo, which is translated into French, and the percussionist is required to choose 7 instruments which represent the 7 vowels which are used in the text.
Li, bu, cha, autre, grand, ton, me, pe, xco, jou, zé, fi, lin. Sagredo. Il y aurait donc aucune différence entre le ciel et la terre. Galilei. Il semble que non. Sagredo. Il n'y a pas 10 ans qu'un homme nommé Giordano Bruno a été brûlé à Rome pour avoir soutenu la même idée. Galilei. Il n'y a pas de doute. Fais tes yeux au tube. Ce que tu vois prouve qu'il n'y a pas de différence entre le ciel et la terre. Aujourd'hui, nous sommes le 10 janvier 610. L'humanité inscrit dans son journal ciel supprimé. Sagredo. Mais c'est affreux, Galilei. J'ai aussi découvert quelqu'un entre sorties de curateur.
The speed and rhythm of the music is dictated completely by the speech. You start out by speaking normally and accompanying yourself, and then gradually you lower your voice during the middle sections and continue playing and accompanying yourself, so that you're speaking the consonants and your instruments are playing the vowels. Officially, you should still be able to understand what's going on.
La vieille dame. Pause. La jeune dame. Pedersoni. Galilei. Le philosophe. Le mathématicien. Pause. Soudainement, Andrea va droit vers la sortie. Sa mère l'arrête. Madame Sarti, Andrea, il sort, le philosophe. Pauvre enfant. Le maréchal. Messieurs, il faut faire remarquer que le bal officiel commence dans 3 quarts d'heure. Une fenêtre s'ouvre et une femme crie « Sauvez-vous! Chez eux, en face, il y a la peste !» L'homme horrifié se sauve. Galilei. Avez-vous vu ma femme de ménage? La femme. Votre femme de ménage s'est effondrée dans la rue. Elle devait le savoir, c'est pourquoi elle est partie. Elle ferme la fenêtre. Les enfants descendent dans la rue. Ils aperçoivent Galilei et se sauvent en criant. Galilei se retourne. À ce moment, arrivent en courant 2 soldats en armure. Les soldats entrent dans les maisons immédiatement. Avec leurs lances, ils repoussent Galilei dans sa maison. Ils verrouillent la porte. Galilei par la fenêtre. Pouvez-vous me dire ce que s'est passé avec ma femme de ménage? Les soldats, on a amené sur la près. La femme après des ouvre la fenêtre. La femme. Toute la rue ici derrière est contestée. Pourquoi ne la fermez-vous pas? Les soldats tirent une corde au travers de la rue. La femme. Et maintenant, personne ne pourra entrer dans son maison. Vous n'avez pas besoin d'appeler ici. Ici, tout est sain. Halte! Halte! Écoutez donc, mon mari est nourri. Il ne pourra ne plus entrer. Salaud! Salaud! On entend de l'intérieur ces pleurs et ces cris. Les soldats sont bons.
One mustn't forget the composers who were innovators, who experimented and who heard a sound which had never been invented before, just in their imagination, and then set about trying to work out how to produce that sound. Barres was a particular case in point. John Cage was another. The real great innovators were responsible for constructing a lot of new instruments which had never existed before. One extremely important work in the development of percussion in the last few years was Stockhausen's Contactor. Like the Bartók, it's scored mainly for piano and percussion, but it also has an electronic tape. So here you have three elements, all of which, in fact, are trying to imitate each other. The electronic sounds, the piano sounds, piano used as a percussion instrument, and the percussion sounds. And if you listen very carefully, you can hear similarities, sort of a dialogue going on between all those three elements. It's an extremely exciting piece to play, because not only do you have to time everything perfectly within yourself and with the piano, but you also have to respond to minute cues from the tape, which, if you don't know exactly when they come, you could miss completely and be out for some time. But it's an extremely exciting piece to play because of this idea of the dialogue between the three instruments. The sad thing about 20th century music, to me, is the fact that music has become so complicated that it's very rare to find people who can actually play it together without a conductor. The conductor has become something of a great convenience. But the irony is that although the conductor is capable of actually unifying the players to a certain extent, there's a limit to the amount they will go wrong following a conductor. There's also a limit to the kind of togetherness you can feel when you're playing chamber music, and any string quartet musician will tell you that. The string quartet, incidentally, is one of the great examples of a traditional Western medium which has survived into the 20th century. And thank God there are some excellent string quartets playing very, very complicated music. And they have to rehearse really a lot. Whereas if they take a contemporary string quartet, they play that, they rehearse that for weeks. If they had a conductor, they could do it on one rehearsal probably. And so most of the music that you hear with players, with group ensembles consisting of about, let's say, 8 players, which could in fact, in the old days, have played together without a conductor. Nowadays they have a conductor. And to me that ruins the whole essence of chamber music, which I think is a terribly important one. I think as a musician, some of the greatest moments in one's musical experience happen when you're playing together with somebody. A few years ago, I discovered some very ancient Chinese texts called the Shi Qing, or Book of Odes, and I became very interested in this, primarily for the reason that I was aware of the fact that the Chinese characters contain within them a wealth of images, and I could imagine building up a whole world of sounds which represented each of the images contained in the text. As is well known, Chinese music has always been composed within what is known as a pentatonic scale, which is basically the black notes of a piano. But the pitches are somewhat different and have a sort of magic quality, and I was very intrigued to try to find out what that magic quality was and to try to extract it in some way without actually using the pentatonic scale. So I invented a scale which contains certain pitches which don't exist on the piano keyboard and have what we know as microtones in them. And I actually built certain instruments which could play those. This was the first piece that I used these microtonal percussion instruments in. And strangely enough, they did do exactly what I had intended, which is to try to sum up the atmosphere or the kind of magic of that world without actually sounding like Chinese music. They can be the largest, the smallest, the loudest, and the quietest. They've got a tremendous dynamic range. They are sometimes comic, they are sometimes curious, but above all, they are beautiful. And you can create tremendous beauty and subtlety with percussion instruments.